So welcome to session 3 of our study of the Passion of Jesus, a story we all know well, and hopefully by taking it piece by piece and doing a deep dive here, it'll open up all sorts of new possibilities and meanings. We've had two very rich conversations related to the first two parts of Passion Week, which would be what we call the Triumphal Entry. And then last week, we had the temple tables story and that wonderful, just all the dynamics of what was going on in the temple, and learning some of the truth behind those stories a little bit, both the what the temple tables, what it would have meant, and how large the temple was. And so it wouldn't have upset and stopped all business by any stretch, turning over a few tables, but it would have certainly alerted some measure of attention, or alerted the authorities who were around there. And interestingly, Jesus is not arrested. There's no arresting that happens there as a result of that. He flips the tables. He calls them a den of robbers, and we talked about what that phrase means. But it doesn't yet elicit a response from the authorities, although it gives us some ominous responses from the religious leaders. As in Mark, it sort of says, after all those events, after Jesus is turning stuff over and messing around and doing some of the things he does, they just kind of go into this place of wanting to plot to kill him, to remove him, because they see him as a threat, not only to their authority, but because it's such a time where the people are gathered and there's a lot of popular sentiment for independence. They see him as a real kind of legitimate political threat. And in that day, they didn't really wait around for you to start a revolution. They kind of tried to nip things in the bud. So there's a lot going on in the socio-political realm that's sort of underneath the surface. And so as we move into today's class, what we have is, in that context of kind of, bubbling stuff underneath the surface, Jesus remains in the temple to do some profound teaching. And today we're going to look at 3 particular areas of that teaching. Now, there are many more. We just can't cover all of it, but it's worth looking at. But we're going to be looking at 3 areas, as I said. The question of taxation, that wonderful exchange that Jesus has, and the brilliant response that he gives about, should we pay taxes to Caesar? The idea of the greatest commandment, the scribe that approaches him and asks about the commandments, and then the story that we typically call the widow's mite story is what we'll be focusing on. So those are the 3, and you may have noticed that in 2 of those stories, it really engages money and how we use money and what money means to us. Okay. And that's where I had you grab your dollar bills, because I want to do a brief exercise. Money is something that really has a lot of value in our society, whether we have too much of it or too little. It's something that we can easily focus on. And as we pick up our dollar bills, I just wanted to kind of use these dollar bills and just look at them again. Maybe you've done this as a kid, maybe you've done it in more recent years than that, but just to really look at our money, or one piece of it, and examine what it tells us, about who we are. Okay, because we use these terms, they monetary terms kind of find their way into our common discourse all the time. We spend time, we spend money. The things that we spend have to do with things we value. So it's important, I think, to look at stuff like this and say, what does this say about who we are and what we value? So I just want to look at this, and now I know many of you have a $1 bill, but if it's a 5 or anything else, just in general, as you look at our currency, the currency you have, what images, both the front and the back, are most prominent to you? What words are most prominent? What stands out?
The denomination.
Okay, the number itself. Okay, what else?
United States of America.
Mm-hmm. this bold typeface on both sides that indicate very clearly where it comes from.
The president.
Yeah, this presidential picture on any one of them. And the newer ones are even larger, I think, some of the pictures, but on the older dollar bills, you know, it's still centered. George Washington, though. Yep. What else?
What's a pyramid doing?
On the back, the pyramid. Yeah. Yes. Well, if you're into Dan Brown, it would be a sign of the Illuminati, but really it's part of one of the many symbols that are all over this document, this currency. And the pyramid represents the beginning of the new order that was in the world with the formation of a democratic government. The pyramid is made of 13 layers, as you'll see, which and the 13 is a symbol that is all over, especially the back, but all over both sides of the currency, 13. And that has to do with the 13 original colonies and this connection to our founding as a country and the way it's presented symbolically, you know, on our currency. So then if all these references to 13, you know, what are some of the, what is it? What's the feeling that this gives you? What do these symbols kind of say about what we value as a country?
Power and strength.
Yeah. How so, Dick? Where does it convey that to you?
Well, the pyramid and also the eagle with the
shield,
arrows and
yeah,
what have you there.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's the eagle with the shield and the arrows, 13 arrows. And then on the other side is the branch with 13 leaves. The pyramid itself is an ancient symbol, one of strength and endurance, one that connects us to some of the greatest, you know, one of the greatest societies or empires in the existence of the world. But yeah, more. Yes. What else does it say?
In God we trust.
Yes, in God we trust. And those Latin words, you may know this, you may not, you may have forgotten. I don't know if I'm going to pronounce it right. Annuit septis means he favors our, it means he meaning God favors our undertaking is kind of what that means. And then e pluribus unum is out of many, one. And you'll notice that both of those phrases have 13 letters. That's intentional. There's a lot of symbolism here, okay? But the language kind of moves us to this divinely favored existence. You know, in God we trust and God favors this experiment. You know, that's what those Latin words symbolize. Any other things that you pick up on as far as, you know, how these images, how these words convey things that we value and that we stand for?
I have a question.
Yes,
I
Marilyn.
never noticed it before. The number 12 appears 4 times on the front.
I never noticed that before either.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think that's part of a treasury code. I'd have to look that one up. But yeah, mine has that too.
Yeah.
Does everyone's have that?
Mine has 11 in 4 places.
I have 5.
It might be that's a reference to the year it was printed, but I don't know for sure. But yeah, it's funny when you start looking at this stuff, you see things all the time that you don't.
Interesting that there's a different number on our different bills. You know, it's 12 here on mine. So does that mean mine is newer?
Well, I was just suggesting that I think it might have to do with the year it was printed. So it could be.
It says series 2017. Oh, I lost my picture again.
No, there's voice. Okay. So what other values does our currency suggest? We've talked about how it conveys this idea of strength, this idea of trusting in God and the providence of God that guides us. And so kind of being a divinely inspired experiment and divinely supported experiment. Anything else that it communicates to you?
Unity, out of many, one. Yeah,
that spirit of unity, absolutely. And this idea, you know, on the front, you know, there's the scales. The scales represent the scales of justice. There's this sense of real, this experiment into liberty, freedom, all being equal. That's a stated intent. Now, we know that the ideals presented on a piece of paper like this, or any piece of paper, be it the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, they are ideals, okay? They express certain things that may or may not be true, or may at one point have had have been real or manifest, and then at other times it hasn't been the case. So as you look at this, you know, how much of a claim does the stuff that you see on your bills, how much do you even think about that? Does it have a claim on you in terms of the way you live? You know, do you find yourself trying to live into these ideals? Are they still resonant with you? Do you can make connections to that? Or do you just use this to go and buy your coffee? Heck, we're using this less and less, you know,
Coffee.
right? So you don't really, so that's, you don't really think of this as a, you know, for all the symbols that it represents. It doesn't really have a claim on you. Anyone else have a comment about that? And if am I being clear on how what I'm asking?
Yes,
This
but
idea that this has all these symbols and it says all this stuff. This is like a document, a living document, and yet it's also a transactional device. So how do you see it? How does this, what claim does this have on you in terms of the way you live your life? Marcia and then Patty.
But okay, I go spend the dollar freely, but those principles and what they stand for are very much with me in a holistic way. I'm not thinking about it when I'm spending money, like you said, but it's in my heart, knowing who we are.
Okay. So those ideals are certainly a part of your life, but not necessarily as reminded by the particular currency. Okay. Anyone else? Patty?
No, I don't think about them in terms of money, but I probably will now. But the thing that I think is that many times when we write something down, whether it's here or in any other document, it's something we aspire toward. And if we don't pay attention to it regularly, we might forget it. And I'm probably going to pay attention to this dollar much more now, because those symbols matter to me. And they matter to me. And they matter to the original fellows who put this together, even though they didn't include me. They were still doing something. I was just reading Heather Cox Richardson. She said, even though they didn't include all of us, they did something very radical. The idea that men could get together and form a union where all people were equal, people being men, was radical, because before it was about all people who should own land that should have power. So, and I didn't know that. I think that's fantastic. These are aspirational goals, but they're meant to remind us too. I mean, in many ways, for me, they're going to remind me.
Yeah. And I think that's important to at least at times consider that this is not just a transactional document, but it's a teaching document.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is something that reminds us something of what we value. Okay. Mm-hmm. Dick, and many of you notice that there are prominent numbers on every one of these. Okay. This, in a sense, denotes the currency's value, right? That's a number. But what we're seeing is there's so much more of value stated on these documents, value by way of values. And it is so vital, or I should say this, it is a worthy question and consideration to consider what the connection or break might be in the way we perceive the value of currency and how we use it and the values that it expresses. And I think that that's going to be part of our conversation today, because that is some of what Jesus really gets into with his conversations about money today. With that said, are there any other kind of reflections or comments before we kind of move into our reading of today's passage and then kind of get into further discussion? Any other comments? Horty.
I've just always been struck by the detail in the engraving. There's a lot of attention to the beauty, the ornamentation. there's really a lot of effort and a lot of energy and a lot of skill and a lot of art in that.
I love that too, Horty. And I've always found it to be, at least in my mind, equal parts artistic expression as much as it is anti-counterfeiting. Is a lot of the ornateness originated with some of those efforts, but it's so beautiful when you really look at it. Plus, there's all sorts of hidden pictures in there, okay? You'll find that, maybe you've noticed that little owl that's in the upper right corner on the front side of a dollar bill that sits right next to the one there. He's really cute and he sits in there. It represents in part the wisdom, the wise owl, maybe might even connect to Ben Franklin there, but I think it has to do with trying to make it harder to fabricate, to counterfeit. But yes, it's delightful, and there's nothing wrong with that. It is a piece of beauty. When we go to different countries, I think it's quite striking sometimes the way the money is so colorful and really tells a story. And there's something very powerful about immersing ourselves a little bit into what the story is on various currency and what the values presented are. Marilyn, did you have?
I was just noticing that each of the shields around the number 1 are different.
Yeah, I just noticed that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I never noticed that before.
It's really cool. I know there's a lot of detail there.
Okay, Dan, I'm not seeing the owl.
Yeah, I didn't see an owl either.
I don't see an owl either.
Oh, okay. Well, it's up. Let's see. It's hard for me to see with these particular glasses. Is it on that side?
I think he has a counterfeit one.
I'm wondering.
Oh,
if
yeah,
you have
yeah.
a-
You probably just have a counterfeit one there.
I wonder if you have a newer one or something.
Oh,
were
you know
these-
what? They could be changing this, but there was always an owl sitting, and I can't see him right now because of these particular lenses don't give me. I think I see him though. I think he's immediately to the left of the shield in the middle, but I could be wrong there. He's really little, but he was right up in there all the time. But anyway, you can look that up and see if that's changed, because that
It
was
looks-
always one we were taught to look for.
Do we need a magnifying glass to see?
Uh-huh.
He's really tiny.
I think so.
It looks
When
to
were
me
these
online-
first
I do.
printed?
I used to have the
down.
eyes. I mean, we all used to have eyes that could just look at it and see. I forget it. Let's not get distracted. Okay. Marilyn, did you want to add something else?
I was just going to say that the values that are expressed on this bill are things that I was taught, mostly in school, but some from my parents. And that because they're here on the bill, it gives it legitimacy to me, that it indeed matches, what I was taught. And
Yeah.
that's all I was going to say.
Well, I think you're right. Whether or not it matches what we were taught, think about what kind of legitimacy and or authority it provides the currency and our country when you claim such bold themes as God favors our undertaking in Latin, and in God we trust. This sort of claiming and connection, yes, part of it is aspirational, that this is what we long to do and be, but yet it also is claiming that we are divinely favored. Okay. And we'll get to see, what that can do, because it can inspire and it can also legitimate. It can lead us to greater, bolder, braver things, and it can lead us to a place where we claim that, and it's a means of control. Okay, we see that. And again, it's not unique to this country or any country. It's what happens within humanity. Okay, so we'll get to see a little bit of that, and that's part of what Jesus faces in his world. Okay. Any other comments before we get into the reading? Cecily.
Hey, somewhere in the back of my mind, I think of money.
Unfortunately, your connection is, I can't make out what you're saying.
Almost very evil.
Unfortunately, Cecily, all of that was just a very confusing kind of sound. It's like the connection is a little low. I'm not sure if that's an internet thing or if you're able to move and see if there's a strengthened way to do it, or if you have good cell coverage, you might sign on with your phone and see if that helps, because I really want to hear what you have to say. And it looks like that might have, oh, there she is. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, my internet. I look at my type of exchange.
Unfortunately, it's still happening.
You can't hear me?
No.
Okay,
I mean,
I'm gonna
I can hear
read.
you in bits and then it just kind of goes off.
Okay,
Can you come back on your phone and try it with cell coverage? No. Oh, okay. I hope so. Anyway, I hope she's able to come back. Why don't we move into the reading for today? And when she comes back, if and when she comes back, we'll entertain her comment. But I need, if possible, 3 volunteers to read 1 paragraph each from the Mark passage that we had for today. And I just want to make sure, yeah, you know. So Horty, you're first. Anyone else? How about some new folks that haven't read? I'm going to be putting it right up on the screen, so it's going to be nice and big and easy. There's no hard words. There's no names this time. Jane, okay. Jane's number 2. She's the second paragraph. And last but not least.
Well,
Thank you,
I
Marilyn.
wait as long as I
I
can.
know you waited a
I wanna
long
be
time.
quick.
I was hoping Dick would raise his hand as the new kid.
All
on the
right,
block,
all
but
right.
no, you know what? I'm not going to browbeat you into doing it, Dick, because I know I'll hear about it later.
Okay, I'll do number 4. Thank you.
Okay, if we have a 4th one, I will make sure. All right, let's, no, that's not it. That's another one. I don't know why it does that. Let's see. When I hit share and I'm hitting on the, let's see, this. No, not that again. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So first reader was Horty. First paragraph, please.
Mark 12, 13 through 17, 24 through 34, 41 through 44. Then they sent him to some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. And they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me see it." And they brought one. And he said to them, "Whose head is this and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Jesus said to them, "Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the thing that are God's." And they were utterly amazed at him.
Yes. Jane.
One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Then the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and beside him there is no other. and to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. This is much more important than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." After that, no one dared to ask him any questions.
Thank you. And lastly, Marilyn.
He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on."
Thank you. Very familiar stories. Wonderful. I mean, that's some of the best, that interaction, that response that Jesus gives to the Pharisees and the Herodians, I find to be just the height of brilliance. Let's get into that a little bit. You know, there's a lot of details in here, much like when we're looking at our currency. There's a lot of details in these stories that we end up just kind of glossing over because we're not really sure what to do with them. And in this case, there's a detail that appears right at the outset, where it talks about who comes to approach Jesus with that first question about paying taxes to the emperor. And it mentions the Pharisees and the Herodians. Does anyone have any idea who those people are and why they would differentiate them in that way?
I was just going to ask you.
Well, let's play with it a little bit just to see what you may know about that. And I'm going to hold off on the seminary student but in case there's anyone else, but no, go for it, Patty.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
No, I don't see any other hands up. Please. I don't mean to.
Okay, well, this is just a little bit of the research I did, but one of the comments was that the Pharisees especially were kind of competing with Jesus and his disciples for attention and following. And of course, the Herodians were supporting Herod, and Herod was supporting Caesar because Caesar was the one who was taking care of him. But I didn't know that about the Pharisees. I didn't know there was a group called the Pharisees. I mean, I did know that, but I didn't know they were competing with Jesus. But essentially, that makes sense.
Yes.
And that kind of competition is seen in these arguments. They're trying to convey, who are you going to side with, and in these arguments. So
yeah, they're like political parties. And just as Patty said, all of that is true. There's a lot of competition. And another thing to add is both the Pharisees and the Herodians would have been desirous of a free and independent Israel, Jewish state. Okay. But they, within the Pharisees, they were anticipating that to happen through a return of a Davidic king.
That's right.
And in the Herodians, they were very much more aligned with the ancestry of Herod. And so they would have anticipated a return to that ideal in their mind. But they were both, oh, go ahead.
That didn't include Gentiles.
Correct. It's very Jewish oriented.
Yeah.
And yet, as Patty said, especially the Herodians, they were much more tied to the Roman state. Okay, because they were sort of puppet. There was a lot of puppet government. There was a lot of propping up. There was some support that happened that then at least divided some of those allegiances. So when they approach Jesus, they have a lot of agenda. Okay, Marcia?
I still don't understand who the Pharisees are.
The Pharisees would be, and at that time it didn't quite yet develop, but they were sort of a political party that was, they were the teachers of Torah. They were the ones that were really, really smart, really well versed in the commandments, in the law, in Judaism, and preserving it in a time of a lot of sort of diaspora, a lot of, just dilution of sort of identity. And so they were sort of, they sort of saw themselves as those who were the interpreters of the law for the people in that modern time. Now, they weren't given quite that much authority really until after the temple fell. When the temple fell and there was no longer a centralized place, that's when the whole rabbinic tradition developed, and the Pharisees ended up filling a lot of those roles because you had this dispersed sense of church or synagogue. Okay, but that's later. So within the context of these stories, the Pharisees were presented as those who were sort of the religious authorities of that day, but not just sort of the bookish types. They were the really ones that were trying to help teach the people how to apply the law to their lives in ways that they felt were liberating. So you can see then, as Patty mentioned, there's a lot of competition because Jesus was kind of doing the same thing, but he was taking it to next level stuff and pushing their buttons and making it, so that everything that they thought was true, he keeps poking at and keeps undercutting and undermining in their minds. And so over time, that builds up the sense of from annoyance to, all right, we got to get rid of this guy. Okay. I don't know. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. So both of them want this sense of Jewish independence, so that they have this agenda-driven question. So knowing that's kind of where they're coming from, how do you think they would answer that question to Jesus? How do you think the Herodians and Pharisees would answer their own question?
What's the question?
Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar?
Well, it would appear that Jesus is not supporting the general idea.
I would say that, look again. But what I'm asking now is, based on what you know of the Herodians and the Pharisees, how do you think they would answer their own question? How do their lives illustrate how they would answer the question? Because we can say how we would answer a question, but how do their living, how does their example answer the question?
Well, it would appear that they support that structure.
Absolutely right. They live within that structure. We don't really know too much about if there were patterns of resistance within the Herodians and the Pharisees, but how they lived, and Jesus asking them to provide him some money and them instantly being able to come up with it, demonstrates that they sort of willingly lived within that, at least on some level, within that way of being, knowing that Rome is in charge. And here's the other thing. Okay, this is important to know too. Like, so they're going to talk out of both sides of their mouth probably, because they wanted a free Jewish state, but the truth is Rome had the power. But when they asked Jesus this question, they did not care about the answer. They really didn't care which way he answered, because all they wanted from him was an answer. If he answered it either way, he was screwed, right? If he says, no, don't pay taxes, Rome will take him out very quickly. He'd be, arrested and put on a cross for sedition. If he said, don't pay taxes to the emperor. If he says, yes, pay taxes to the emperor, then he loses all credibility within the Jewish people, as a teacher, as someone who's on their side, as someone that's part of this expectation of a return to glory. Okay. So all they wanted him to do is answer the question. And that's, Dick, where he really doesn't. He doesn't answer the question, which is why it's so brilliant. He responds to the question, but he never quite answers it, does he?
Well, though, if you read kind of between the lines, it appears that he's coming up with a kind of a bleak way of responding by not responding, by showing something greater in his own viewpoint.
I suppose you could look at it as bleak, but I think it's a technique that he uses quite often, and that is to flip the question back on the asker, because Jesus' way of being in the world, his way of teaching, his way of following God and of living all of these things is not about having all the answers for everybody. It's not about, hey, just do this and it's all good. No. It may be part of that. He may have things to say about that, but ultimately, it is always up to the person to decide that very thing. And by turning the question back on them, he is simply turning it on us. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. How do we define that? Up to us. The law, the stories within Judaism certainly indicate that everything is God. Psalm 15, I think, all things belong to God. Okay, so there's that. And yet they live within a society where Caesar claims these things. And to refuse to pay means certain death. But Jesus is responding to the question because he knows what's at stake and he's about to live it. He's about to live it. So he's not afraid, but that's what's at stake, is that we each have to decide, where is our true value? What are those things that we decide belong to Caesar, belong to God? And that's really that's the crux there. So they try to trap him in a political question, and he turns it about and asks them that, or indicates to them and to all of us that the question's much larger than that. And it's kind of a classic thing, it's a classic Jesus teaching technique. I saw a hand. Yeah, Boyce?
I think it's really a good way that Jesus answered that, because he's actually separating God and Caesar. And he's saying, you live in both worlds and you have to live with both worlds. So here's Caesar's world and here's God's world, and you serve both.
Yes.
To some degree anyway, on the Caesar side.
Yes. No, it's absolutely true. And I want you to take a look at this with me now, because that's a good segue, Boyce. It's cut off a little bit on my screen, but you can see it for the most part. Not easy to read, but this is a Roman denarius from the time of Jesus. Okay. So what is this depicting? What is this showing us? What is it trying to say? We just did an exercise looking at our own currency. Now let's look at some Roman currency. So as you look at this, what is it communicating? I'll help with some of the words because it's difficult to read it, but the words that are printed around there, on the front, the left picture is a picture of Caesar Tiberius. Okay, that was who was emperor at the time of Jesus. And the language around it says, Caesar Augustus Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. His father was Augustus Caesar. Now, did you see what the language was? Son of the divine Augustus. Okay. The emperor claimed, and the Senate, the Roman Senate, voted that Augustus was divine, was a god. Okay. So what does that make Tiberius?
Son of God.
The son of a god. Okay. Now on the back of the coin, and again, it's a little off center. It might just be worn there. It's got a picture, a seated woman. Many speculate that that's Tiberius's wife, Julia, but the inscription is Pontifex Maximus, or Maxim, and it means high priest. Okay, that's what the back communicates. So on that currency, you have this, on one side, a sort of a representation of the Son of God, and then this high priest connection of religion and power to money. So it's a contrast. It's a deep contrast there, that what does the Roman Son of God look like, and what do they value, and how is it communicated, and how is it all connected? And then look at Jesus and compare and contrast. And that's a really big part of this too, is that throughout the Gospels, the Gospel writers are comparing the type of leadership, the types of the ways of being in the world, the Roman Empire versus God's empire, using the same symbolic terms, because that's where the contrast is strongest. The Roman Son of God versus Jesus, the Son of God, the one that's tied up in the war horses and the power and the military might, and the one who comes a riding in on a donkey. Okay, it's very, very, it's stark. I mean, but that's what makes it so memorable and important and powerful to us, and also challenging, because we know what's at stake. You don't just get to say, "Oh, I support Jesus." Well, okay, maybe you can say that, and that's where the question is: where are our lips and our hearts meeting, and our hands, and our feet, all of it? Comments, Patty?
Well, one of the things that struck me, especially when in view of what you said about images, and he brings up the idea of images with Caesar. But when he says, give to God what is God, the thing that hits me is what is in Genesis, that we are made in the image of God.
Right.
And because we are made in the image of God, they would have gotten that. And that would be a huge contrast for them, because it's a conundrum to serve. If you're Jewish, you do not serve any other gods.
That's right.
And so this rhetorical answer, which was very Greek, was a teaching answer. It's a teaching answer. It's an answer that says, where's your real allegiance?
Yeah. And what does it look like to be in the world but not of it? And is there a path that can be carved where you can find a way to honor God even as you are asked to pay taxes? Mm-hmm. And again, we can talk about it, and we can say what we believe and how we feel about it, but then how do our actions kind of match with that? And that's a constant evaluation. Mm-hmm. that Jesus is putting on all of us, really. What does it mean to give to Caesar what is Caesar and to give to God what is God's? He doesn't define that for us. We've got the tradition, we've got scripture, we can go back and look at things. We know what maybe we feel like we should do, we ought to do. There's a tension, though. Mm-hmm. And we live no less in that tension now in the modern world than at any time. So that's an important question to consider. And there's a similar vibe that moves through. There's a tension that exists as we move to the next part of the readings today. The whole question about the greatest commandment. Jewish tradition holds that there are 613 commandments. Did you know that? 613 commandments. If you read through the Torah, you will find 613. And there's a helpful way of thinking about them that later Midrash, rabbinic tradition, has come up with, and that is there are 365 negative commandments, the sort of prohibitions, don't murder, do not steal, do not cheat. There are 365 of those to correspond to 365 days in the year, and there are 248 positive commandments that correspond to the parts of the body. Within ancient Judaism, there was an understanding that there were 248 limbs or parts of the whole body, beyond bones, but just the parts. So that's how they sort of devised this way of remembering. But the truth is, when Jesus is asked the question, he distills it down to 2, right? Love God, love neighbor. More than that, but love God with all that you are, and love your neighbor as yourself. So tell me, when he does that, when Jesus does that and responds to the question like that, what is he saying as he's telling us that? What's he communicating there? Is he saying that these are the only two that matter, so just disregard the rest? Some people look at it that way. Is he saying that?
No. It's contained.
So what is it? What is he trying to communicate by distilling it down to those two? Boys?
Seems to me that if you follow those two, all the rest will be taken care of.
Yeah.
Thou shalt not kill. Well, if you love your neighbor as yourself, your neighbor
Right.
is everybody. And so that's taken care of, mom and dad, the parent thing. And, so those are the most important if you follow them. The other 8 or 600 and whatever are going to be taken care of.
Yeah. Well, it becomes the lens. Those two become the lens through which all the other ones operate. Okay. So that's where Jesus was, he was so clear. It's like, if that's the lens, if loving your neighbor is the lens, then that's why if my neighbor's donkey falls into the ditch on the Sabbath, I'm not just going to be like, stinks to be you. I'll help you out tomorrow when the Sabbath is over. No. It's about loving your neighbor, and don't let the Sabbath be the deciding factor. Look, the intention is to rest on the Sabbath. Why? Because they were slaves once, and to rest is the sign of a free people. It's not just that it's good for your body and your heart. Yeah, that's true too, but it's a very symbolic gesture. But Jesus is saying that, there's things that are more important than that. And loving our neighbor is something that's what matters. So use that as the lens through which all the other ones are that they help us shape, because though the 611 other commandments, they help show us what loving God and loving neighbor look like. They do help, clarify some of that. But if we have question, focus on loving God and loving neighbor first and operate from there. And then the rest, as Boyce said, will follow. Any other follow-up? I saw Bonnie, but I know we might have said what you were going to say, but if you had something you wanted to add. Okay.
That covered it. I was going to say
Okay.
about the same thing.
All right. I saw you nodding your head, but I wanted to check in anyway. Horty?
It's always seemed to me the difference is the spirit of the law and the letter of the law.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of it does pick up on that for sure. And he really, the way he moves through his whole ministry is one who is focused on much more about the spirit of the law, but attending to the letter of it as well, that it matters. It's just not ultimate. It's not what is the ultimate. So yeah, I think he's good at defining the difference. And what's also important to notice is that this distillation of the commandments in this story is not only, it's not only the lens that all the commandments are viewed through, but it's the lens through which the rest and maybe the whole passion story is viewed through too. And to look at all the interactions that Jesus has as being embodiments of people or him loving God and loving neighbor, that they become illustrations of this, okay? That it's the lens through which the rest of the story sort of flows. So Jesus is saying, love God with everything you are, all times, and love your neighbor as yourself. From here on out, he's going to show us what that looks like. Okay. And what it begs of us is that it's like we can say that, we, like the scribe, we can parrot or we can say it from a very sincere place. And again, I'm not judging this, but this is the truth. This is what's always true for us. We can say it with the best of intentions and sincerity. Love God, love neighbor. And then when the rubber meets the road, where is our value? Where do we operate from. Okay. Because the passion story gets real tough real quick. And so when we're not feeling the presence of God, how do we love God then? How does Jesus love God? You know, that sort of thing. It really puts it to us very quickly, in much more intensity. Jane?
What just came to me was how we want to have those two as the most important commandments, but we look at the other commandments, and people have done this for, centuries, and that's how we judge one another. That's how we divide up between groups. You do it this way, and I don't think that's the right way to do it. And that's how religions have, used those other commandments to judge people. And I think that always coming back to the most important commandments, which Jesus does in other places in the Bible as well, is really critical for us to take that deeply to heart and to practice.
Such a beautiful comment, Jane. Absolutely, 100%. I mean, how many times in the stories did people basically use societal rules or various commandments, various ways that identify who someone is, be they accurate or not? But how many times do those get used as wedges to isolate, to separate, and then to define who is not my neighbor? Mm-hmm. And so then the question of who is my neighbor is about, within certain realms. Well, these people are not even capable of being my neighbor, because they don't fit in with this category. I dismiss them. And Jesus comes in to just pop all those bubbles and break down all those ways that we separate and say, no, do you realize that by asking the question, who is my neighbor, I'm showing you that there's no such thing as someone who's not your neighbor. All are your neighbor. So to stop trying to create those divisions. But yeah, that's what we face. That's what we face. And there's these quiet ways and also not so quiet ways. We live in a time where it's not so subtle, where we try to divide and separate and classify and write off, dismiss, mistrust, all of it. We create all these divisions that then make it very easy to operate within a certain field that we've created as to whom deserves our love and attention and care and consideration. And so these are not new concepts, but he is trying to help break down the way we create all these extra layers of relational BS, basically, between how we really see each other and how we respond, how we live into that. He's saying, don't be fooled. See each other as God sees you. Any other comments? Marcia and then Patty.
I have a problem with this. When I said loving your neighbor, I don't have a problem with, but he says as yourself. And so that always bothers me because I don't think we do a good job of that. And so it's like, why did he say that when, it's like we have to learn to love ourselves and accept ourselves. It seems to be harder. And then there's a lot of people who will do anything and everything for their neighbor, but they don't take care of themselves.
Right. No, he's not saying be codependent or do everything at the sacrifice of yourself, but to love your neighbor as yourself is a statement that there is no difference between someone else and me, in the sense that I am a part of you and you are a part of me. So the dividing lines that we have created, be it nationality, religion, sex, all the things are as nothing to God. But to love your neighbor as yourself means there are no lines of division. So start there. And yes, there are ways that we struggle to live that, especially when it comes to self-love. And that's a constant growing, because that there's no perfect way to move through that. but to be attentive to the reality that everyone is my neighbor, to start from that place, and that you are me, and my well-being is connected to you as a vine is to the fruit that that vine produces. You know, we've seen that image. It's a powerful reformulation of what it means to be a part of the world. So it's a starting point, you know. It's not trying to, you know, it's not easy to put it into action, but it's a starting point. It's a lens. Patty, excuse me.
For me, these two passages are saying two things. One is that there's no absolute right. He's inviting me to discernment in every situation where it's difficult. And there is always a tension to want to know absolutely what the right thing to do is so you don't get in trouble. But he's saying you can't do that. You have to decide. And the basis of your decision is based on the word love. It's in both of the commandments. And the word love is not a noun, it's a verb. It's a verb that means discern. It's a verb that means include. And it's a verb that he's inviting them to look at. They may see it as a noun, but it's not a noun. For me, it's not a noun, it's a verb. And it's an active invitation to interaction, which is different than absolute.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is that constant. So it's a consideration that it's on us to kind of be in this mode of discernment. And it is not about a stated intent or a feeling, but it's about a way of being in the world. It's about a way of being with each other. That's what love is. So yeah. And again, as he says this, as he distills it, he's in the process of showing us. Look, his whole ministry is a process of showing us, but this is such an intensive way that he's about to show us what love looks like, you know, as he meets all the people that he encounters. All right, let's continue. So as we move through that, the greatest commandment, we have this example come right up about what's called the widow's mite. Okay, the story of the widow. And we've all received a lot of different perspectives and considerations about this story, but really what I want to start with today is, what are we supposed to think about the widow in terms of the way the story presents her? What are we supposed to think about her? And in what ways is her gift kind of symbolic of Jesus' passion journey, the whole passion story journey? What are we supposed to think about her, though, to start? Bonnie?
Well, I take from that God was the most important thing in her life. She's giving everything she has to that, where maybe some of the other people that had more money and said they're giving out of their abundance. Like, I think I have the New Testament. It was, and I think it said they're giving what they have left over or something like that. Like they have this spare money they can afford, but but God was not first in their lives. It was kind of like an aside, where in the widow's life, that God was everything. Yeah.
She gives from a different place of generosity. Okay. And it's kind of unfortunate that they call it the widow's mite. That's the King James version. I don't mind the term mite, but it really should be mites. It's two. And I think that's important, because it wasn't just that she was deciding to give or not, but she could have given one coin and held one for herself. She could have. Even that little bit would have at least gotten her some type of food. But what it demonstrates is a deep, full commitment in trusting in generosity. It's different to give, when we give a lot of times, and again, this is not, We all do this. We give from our abundance. We'll give the extra spaghetti sauce that's been in the back of the cabinet, or the pasta that no one's eaten, or that sort of thing. And it's good stuff. It's not that it's bad and gone nasty. No, but it's just stuff that we tend to give because, well, we haven't been eating that. Let's clear this out and let's give that to the food drive or whatever. It's beautiful. It's fine. It's needed. But there's a different energy when we're about to sit down at a meal we've created, and all of a sudden we realize, or someone comes to the door and is starving, and we give them the meal, all the food right off of our table. Okay, there's a difference there, and so that's kind of what's being lifted up here. This woman is trusting in a way that is quite different. She is giving her full self to this offering. And it's not just an offering to the temple. When it says the temple treasury is used to help the poor. The temple had a wonderful system set up. And in fact, at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, talks about this prophetess named Anna, who was also a widow, who was very much helped out by the temple. The temple was designed to care for the orphans and the widows, to provide food, to help out. It was a system that's, I guess, not that much different than how we do church today. We try to have systems in place to help, whether it's funds that the pastor operates, or whether it's the gathering in meals and the extended meals, the offsite meals, the ways that we find, we buy food and support efforts at Rock Creek School, all of this stuff. But it's connected. It's connected. And it begs the question, how are we doing in terms of meeting the needs of those around us? And how do we see those people? That's a big question. So that's why I started with, how are we meant to see this widow? How are we supposed to respond to her? What are we supposed to think about her? Is she a pathetic figure? Is she one that's the product of a terrible system? How could it be that someone is so low, so poor? Or is she a mighty figure of faith that happens to have no name and no voice, and yet she offers everything that she has in trust? What do you think? Dick?
I don't know why, but this trusting element here is so profound, at least for me. And it brings me back to readings many years ago, Leo Buscaglia and his travels, where he goes from country to country, basically with nothing, and puts himself, at the mercy of others, and how others almost invariably take him in and provide comfort and his needs. And just to be able to do that, in a current day, just profound to me.
And that's a powerful reflection. That's how these stories then can touch our lives. Yeah, it's a story about Leo Buscaglia, but it impacts Dick. It impacts each one of us in the way we see our neighbor. So really learning how it is we see this person and how we might shift the way we see her in this story may well open us up in our real lives to how we see others in similar so-called situations. But it's important to sort of pay attention. All right, how do we really see her? Oh, we know how we should see her, but how do we really see her? Patty? And then Ken?
I think of another story that Jesus has told about the rich man, and when he's
Asking about how do I get into the kingdom of God? And he says, I'm doing all of that. And then he says, sell all your things and follow me. She's the one that doesn't have anything anymore, and she's following. She's not encumbered by riches. So she's the example for the rich man, for me,
Yes.
anyway.
Yes.
And it connects to that story.
No question. It absolutely connects to that story. And she is a powerful, I think she's intended to be a powerful example for him, for that story, but for all of us, for all of those who witness her in the context of the gospel, and then for those of us who read it like this afterwards. I saw Ken's hand first, and then Jane.
There's an old sermon illustration that you've probably heard about Henry Ford, and he brought his advisors together, and he says, I've decided that I want to give the greatest gift of philanthropy in the history of the world. And I'd like you to find out what the greatest gift is, so I can give $1 more. And so they did lots of research, and they finally came back to Henry, and they said, well, best we've been able to find is the largest gift of philanthropy is described in the Bible as this widow who gave her 2 coins. And Henry Ford realized that he was not willing to give a gift the size of hers because she gave all that she had.
Exactly.
That's great.
It is great. And it's also, it's pushing that button, which is the point of part of the point of these stories, is it pushes that button within us that it's not just about a specific amount. It's about giving our full selves. And what does that mean? These stories, they evoke questions. They evoke questions in the people who are in the stories, but more than that, as I've said, these gospels are arguments. They're intended to elicit a response. And this is part of how it happens. Our buttons get pushed, and no one's going to tell us, oh, this is the roadmap. No, we have to discern. And that's why church community and Bible study can be meaningful, because we need community a lot of times to help us discern, to find accountability, to find deeper compassion, to break down some of the places where we might not be seeing, what's really happening. Jane, did you want to add to that too?
I looked at the first story about the Caesar and the money and how we looked at money, and on those coins and on our dollar bills, we were looking at former presidents, leaders, and yes, we have admired many of them over the years and looked to them as we have many great leaders. But then Jesus raises up in a Bible story that's read by millions through centuries, a widow, extremely poor. She was the kind of person that needed them to give money to her maybe at times out of their temple funds. And the difference between also to me was that the first story was about giving money back to the government that we owe and do through taxes. And the other was just out of generosity to the temple. And it makes me look again at the people that are doing very profound and beautiful acts of generosity. And they aren't always big in terms of monetary amounts, but they are, to look to them as examples, like we look to her, how we can better serve and be generous in so many different ways.
Yeah, that's true. It's so true. It all matters. It all matters. And that's part of what this, when Jesus is asking the disciples to see, he says, look at her. Okay. He really means look at her and value her. The temple values her. She was welcome to be there. She wasn't shunned. She wasn't looked at. Jesus could have said, oh my gosh, don't give that. Oh, keep that for yourself. You need that. What a devaluing thing that would have been to say that. And the question then comes, how many times have we seen that widow and responded the same way? Look, with good intention, with wanting them, oh, please don't feel like you need to give. I want to help you. We're missing the point. If that's how, we then basically say what you have to offer isn't worth anything. Keep it. That's an unintended way that we often see this widow and others like her, who we classify as poor, mentally ill, homeless. We devalue what their capabilities can be when there are so many ways that we each can contribute, whether it's through money or whether it's through other ways. And learning how to see the value in each other is a constant spiritual practice but it has a lot of ramifications, because I think each one of us knows the times when someone's looked at us and not really seen us, or when we felt devalued in what we had to offer, no matter what it was. It doesn't feel good when you're looked at that way, when you're dismissed. And yet Jesus looks at her and receives and accepts what she has to offer. That's a part of this too. Yes, it's about her generosity, her trust, her faith, but it's about being part of her world in ways that receive her fully as a full human being who happens to be a widow, who happens to not have a lot, but to be a part of her world. So that when we see her, do we think, oh my gosh, that's so great, thank you? Or do we think, oh, don't do it, please stop? Or do we think, I wonder where her next meal is coming from, or the one after that? How do we see her? It's a question that really maybe shouldn't be answered in a 10-minute or 5-minute process, but it's a deeper process, a deeper question than that. How do we see her, and how do we see each other? And it comes back to that neighbor question, doesn't it? That the barriers are not there. So she's already our neighbor. How do we see our neighbors? That's when we learn how to do that with Christ-like eyes, our world breaks open. Our world breaks open. Comments about that portion right now? Dick, excuse me.
Well, I'm trying to relate this to right now, to how we live ourselves and today. And what I kind of come away with is it has to hurt a little bit. In other words, I mean, we all have this balance of, want to have a good life, a nice house, whatever it is. And on the flip side of the coin is, well, okay, stipends here and donations there and what have you. But if you go beyond and it starts to say, gee, I got to sacrifice here a little bit, it seems to me that's the takeaway from this sort of gospel.
Yeah, it certainly involves, sacrifice is a good word. It certainly involves a willingness to give in a way that does so-called hurt a little bit. But what we often find, and that's why I want to say, I don't want to just leave that one there, because sometimes we can make martyrs out of our giving, or out of ourselves when we give. And that is, there's a place for that. But so often when we risk the kind of giving that you're talking about, the kind that we think will hurt, we find that it's exactly the opposite. That somehow
right.
it liberates us. It frees us from the fear that we thought it would hurt. You know what I'm saying? So there's this sense of that when we step into those moments, and maybe we start with that, say, all right, I want this to hurt a little bit. What we're saying is we want it to matter. I want to give something that actually is asking something of me, that's given more than just the skimming off the top kind of thing.
Exactly.
I want to go deeper. That's a great starting place. And one of the ways we can get into that conversation with ourselves, because I think that really is what this session is about. It's connecting those stories to then, how do we live today? Consider how you spent your money this past weekend, if you can remember back that far, because I know that sometimes I can't remember what I did yesterday. But insofar as you have the ability to remember and records, consider what your spending habits were this past weekend. Were they indicative of how you typically spend your money? Great. How do they express what you value? How does how you spend your money express what you value? When you look back at how what this weekend was for you, to whom or what were you giving your money? Those kind of questions can help us kind of stay rooted in the way that our intentions and our hopes and our ideals mesh with our lived experience.
Can I say one other thing?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, at the last Board of Community Ministries, there was an incident, Patty is aware of this, that I don't know, it kind of relates as well. So what I saw in this incident was not just giving of funds, but was a giving of heart. Stephen, the young boy who has some mental issues, came into the meeting inadvertently, and it was really clear that he was in great distress. His eyes were watered up and what have you, and his demeanor was very noticeable. And Patty picked up on it right off the bat and, tried to comfort him and ask what was happening. And from that point, fortunately, our pastor was at that meeting at that same time and found a way to comfort Stephen. I don't know what happened after that, but anyway, giving of caring of others, and not just money, but however it may come about.
It's a great example, Dick. Yeah. And it's just, how do we practice and train ourselves again in how we see those who enter into our space? Are they interruptions? Are they hurting souls that need some form of attention? Do we have the permission within ourselves individually to see them, or within the groups in which we operate? Patty saw that person, saw Stephen, and really saw into him what was happening there. And she just kind of gracefully moved over, and the energy of the meeting did the same. And it just sort of became, this is important right now. That practice is not always so graceful in various groups in which we operate, and maybe within our individual hearts. And that's just reality. We get stressed, we get caught up in things, we lose sleep, we're worried, so our ability to focus and to see is impacted by a number of factors. So these stories then become instructive as a means of just kind of coming back to those questions. Who do we see? What do we value? How does the way we utilize our resources, our time, our money express what we value? Knowing that we're not asking for perfection here, but it's that constant movement toward growth, toward stepping along the path with Jesus, who's showing us the way. Patty?
It seems to me that Jesus is inviting us all the time, as a God who's still speaking, to live in discernment, and to ask ourselves all the time, is this bringing you closer to connection and happiness, or is this not?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very easy to get turned off to that question for ourselves, that we can want to accumulate money, or we can want to have vacations or whatever. And I think vacations are okay and money's okay, but it's how it dominates us versus opens us. And I struggle with that. I mean, perhaps we all struggle with that, but to me, Jesus' teachings are always about, look at this.
Yeah.
And love is about, look at this.
Right.
Look at this person, look at yourself.
Right.
Are you stuck? And I think about somebody like St. Francis. I mean, I just love the images of him because he was a playboy before he was St. Francis. And he was standing before his father and took off all his clothes and said, I don't want any of this stuff from you at all. I'm going to have to be a monk. And that was outrageous. But it was his way of being the woman that had 2 pennies and giving everything. And his life is about living in faith like that.
Yes.
And I mean, I don't know how you do that. I don't have that much faith, I don't think, but I'm working on it.
That's right. And we may not have that much faith until the moment arises. We don't know if that widow had that much faith before that moment came.
That's true.
All we see is that she walked forward right then and she gave everything she had.
Mhm.
So we almost need not concern ourselves with where our faith has been as we consider these questions, to anticipate that we may well be moved in a completely new direction, when the time is right.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Horty?
I'm coming to see discernment as an action verb rather than accomplishment. And I think it's easy to use that word as a goal. I do discern. I have completed discernment. I've become a discerning person, as a destination rather than as a process. And if we invite ourselves into the process in each and every given moment, at times we will be more generous, at times we will be more fearful. But to continue to have the strength and the wisdom and the bravery just to continue to reinvite and reinvite and reinvite and reinvite and reinvite, no matter how often which side of the coin we've landed on.
Yeah. And that's tough. It's tough because, as Marcia was kind of indicating, it's tough to make it to like, okay, I love the idea of that, but sometimes the reality is I don't know actually how to make it work in real, day-to-day stuff, whether it's about myself or about the ones I meet. And so as Jesus invites us into this place of reflection, I think it's not about sort of, let's get it right, people. It's about get into the mess, get into that action of discerning today and seeing what comes up, and not worrying about the overall arc of our lives, but the mini step that we can take today that moves us somewhere. Allow ourselves to be moved. Allow ourselves allow the possibility that something new actually could happen. Maybe that's what the widow was thinking when she came in. Maybe before she had never given anything like that. We don't know. And the point is, she did it then. She did it in that moment. And so Jesus, in these teachings and the other teachings in the temple, is putting that challenge to each one of us, as much as the people in the stories, teaching us, what is it that we love? What is it that we truly value? And then how can we love God and love our neighbor better? What does it really look like? What does it mean? And he recognizes that sometimes we don't discover what we really love until it's tested. That's what the Passion story illustrates. And in the midst of the testing, we come, we bump into what trust really looks like, and where our trust really can be, where it is, where our love, where we find resistance to that. What we trust and what we love as things start to fall apart is much more illustrative than the easier times in our lives. When love is hard, when trust is hard, that's really instructive. It's really instructive. So I'd like to leave us today with I guess a prayer, and maybe why don't we close our eyes, in fact, as we consider this, that in the ways that we're learning how to love, we recognize that there are so many places in our own lives where our love and our trust are so deeply tested. It might have to do with circumstances, situations. It might have to do with personalities, specific people. But our love and our trust are often tested. And so as we're facing that reality, I invite each one of us, in the same raw and honest way that Jesus kind of approached his tests, and just what would you say to God about that? What is it that you'd want God to know about some of the challenges to love and trust that you're facing? Who are those people, or what are those situations that require more of your love? And where also are the situations, the things, perhaps even the people that may require a reframing of your love. As we consider these things in this moment, may we continue to reflect on them throughout the week, and we'll come back to it and see what might arise. But stay in, friends, stay in that that discernment, that kind of constant opening to how is it that God might be trying to teach me right now what I value, what I really love, and what I trust based on how I'm living. And do it gently. It's not about a judgment here. We're not trying to condemn anybody. We're trying to stimulate growth in ways that it matters. So thank you for the way that you bring that every week in this conversation, to be authentic, to raise questions, and to help one another grow. It's a huge gift. And it's our own contribution to the treasury of wisdom and love in the various communities in which we walk. So for next week, Matthew 26, verses 6 to 13 is the reading. And as always, the notes and the video will be on the church website. Thank you all for being a part of this. Until we meet again. Be in Christ's peace.
Be in Christ's peace. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Blessings on your week.